everybody. My name is Mike Abrams, and I'm excited to host today's Talk at Google. Our guest today is Stefanie Faye, who is a neuroscientist who specializes in how mindset shifts happen from a mechanical and neurological perspective. She has written a book called Biomechanics of Human Communication and hosts a podcast called Mindset Neuroscience Podcasts. I'm excited to have her here today to join us. So welcome, Stefanie.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's an honor.
Cannot wait. We've obviously have met and know each other a little bit, but I remember when we first chatted, I was like, how can you explain this and everything you do in layman's terms? So I want to start there. Can you give what you study, what you work on for the average human to follow? Words there that I'm not sure everyone is gonna understand what they mean.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's hard to put in like one sentence, but the idea of mindset is a very big part of my work, as you mentioned, and it has a lot to do with how we think the world operates, our beliefs about ourselves, the stream of nonstop chatter that seems to be going on. There's a biological, there's a mechanical way that we can look at that, and a lot of it has to do with micro movements, micro frequencies, vibrations, signals that we are picking up constantly, especially from the people around us, and especially in our earliest environments. So that's a really big part of my work, that fuels kind of algorithms and different ways that our networks fire inside our brain that guide our attention, that guide a lot of different mechanisms that lead us to focus on certain kinds of thoughts versus others, to focus on certain facial expressions or parts of a certain person's face versus others. And all of those lead to different ways that we operate in the world, how we react to things, how we react to people and problems. So that's kind of a big overview of this idea of mindset as there's a mechanical aspect to it, a neurological aspect to it.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that kind of a lot of your study starts from those early phases in life. So can you talk a little bit about how when like these early interactions, these things that happen earlier in your life are part of these responses to events and people and how we have reactions?
It's so important for people to understand this, that our brains, when we're born, we are not born with very specific features of the brain that have to do with executive functioning and self regulation. Self regulation is this idea that we can calm ourselves down when we need to, we can stimulate ourselves, we can have a lot more autonomy over our internal state. We're not born with features in our brain, with those features in our brain. We need our earliest environments to be there for us, to model it, and to actually, in very specific ways, through eye gesture, for example, mutual eye gaze starts the arousal system. Eye aversion calms it down. Touch does stuff with endogenous opioids and oxytocin that regulates our system. So all of these things are things that we don't have when we're born. We start to develop those as we grow and as we're surrounded by different people. They are things that are malleable later in life, as we grow, but our earliest experiences are very important for a lot of just our responses, these ones that are very unconscious. We don't realize all these things are influencing what we really pay attention to. And that's a very big part that a lot of people don't realize is operating within them. What they pay attention to is very guided by a lot of our past. These predictive algorithms of what relationships are for, what will they do, what communication is for. Is it used to connect or is it used to intimidate? Manipulate, those kinds of things. So our earliest experiences build that, but I don't want that to be this kind of downer that if we've had really bad experiences when we were little, that we're incapable of change. That's the beauty of the human brain, is it is experience dependent. So while those lay a foundation, if we become conscious of them later in life, if we use effort and intention to examine ourselves and reflect and have a little more intention, we can alter, in a sense, our trajectory. We can take a little more charge of a lot of these influences that are there.
So as you study this and as it becomes like, hey, here's this recognition of maybe this is how I react to a situation because of all of these things in my past. Is there like a recommendation of here's how I should take that recognition and maybe adjust what I'm doing or use that knowledge to, to help as you move forward?
I love that question. I think that one of the biggest steps, and it sounds cliche, but awareness is the first step. And what it's doing, what the idea of recognizing that possibly my reaction, possibly how I'm interpreting this, or that very negative self dialogue that's happening, if I can recognize that there might be roots from my past and not hanging out there, not staying in blame down there, but just recognizing what I like to call the possibility of other possibilities, that this thing that I think is so real, that is so accurate, like how I'm perceiving it, or that this internal dialogue is so true, if I can just recognize that it's actually just electrochemical firing patterns that are based on a lot of stuff that we received from a long time ago and throughout our lives, that it's really just kind of an algorithm. And that algorithm is a problem solving formula, but we can insert new data, we can add new inputs that can disrupt those algorithms and that can actually make our awareness a little more exploratory and open, so that it's not this definite thing that we think we are reacting to or is true. We have this openness of awareness. And I would say that just acknowledging that is a part of what they call flexibility, cognitive flexibility, even something called regulatory flexibility, which is just our ability to, you don't have to know the answer you're going to have now. You don't have to know how you're going to change your responses. Just know that you have the capacity to be a little more flexible in what you think is happening and allow for the possibility of other possibilities that you might not, might not be as accurate as you think you are in a lot of that self dialogue and your reactions. So I do want to just add to that too. It doesn't mean that we can't trust ourselves anymore.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people can feel like, oh no, I can't understand any of my own feelings. There's a lot of what we need to have in our lives that our feelings are guiding us towards, but I'm talking about the things where we get very repetitive and we might have the same kinds of unwanted outcomes over and over again, unwanted thoughts, unwanted internal states, unwanted relationship patterns. Those are the things where if it's not working, if we don't feel like we're making any progress or we're getting stuck, that's where you might want to just take a little examination, because that does mean there's a bit of rigidity happening. And when things are very repetitive and rigid, it means they're not flexible. And that could be a sign that you're working from past based type of algorithms.
Hmm. It's so there's two sayings that come to mind as you were talking that make me think of like here's you're talking about the neuroscience behind this, but it's trust your gut and get out of your comfort zone. Like kind of those two really fit into the like these patterns are happening. You got to get out of your comfort zone. And again, that's not just as you said, not just the downer version of that. There can be the positive version of that. But can you speak a little bit to how those kind of two very common phrases fit into your studies and how people should be thinking about those things of like maybe I should get out of my zone more or maybe I should trust my gut more.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what I would say is in terms of trust your gut, the thing that I feel needs to be qualified is that we do want to create situations that we like. So we want to have a certain internal state. There, it's all relative. So if we are completely fatigued or weary, we want to have more energy. If we're overstimulated, we may want to have some soothing. So it's also very important for us to understand that we're always doing things that we think are going to make us feel better, and feel better is always relative. And so our that gut feeling, which I think is a very unconscious but sensory, visceral state, I think that it can guide us if we get clear on what we want to have as our internal state. So that's the thing that I feel like some people might get a little bit mixed up on is we do have these unconscious kind of influences, and gut. There are a lot of studies that show that our gut does actually play a role in this, as well as our heart. It can be called the little brain. Our heart, it has a lot of intelligence to it. So there is a lot that's going on that is very intelligent and is helping us to make decisions. But I think the thing that a lot of people need to put a little more thought into is where do you want these decisions to take you? Um, we want to have, there's a desired internal state, a desired life experience that we have. And sometimes people are not clear about that. And so, yeah, your gut can lead you to, get the correct answer on this. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're using that power in ways that are making your life better, if that makes sense. So I
Yeah.
think that's just something for people to put a little more intention on, is how do you truly want you to feel? How do you want to feel in conversations, at work? What's that desired internal state? That, if you can land on that and put a little intention, that's where your gut, it's a visceral feeling inside. If you can anchor on that, then that can be what will help you make decisions that align with that desired feeling.
Hmm.
So that's a bit about the gut. And then in terms of get out of your comfort zone, I think that's also really powerful, because what we don't realize is that what sometimes feels comfortable is what I would call a familiar neurochemical state. And this can really apply to things like relationships, where depending on our earliest experiences, there might have been a certain type of neurochemical state that we were accustomed to. It might have been a level of neglect or rejection or suppression or intrusion. And those are familiar. So our body has already figured out the algorithms it needs to respond to those. So that's energy efficient in a way. The familiar
Hmm.
stuff is energy efficient in our body. What's not familiar is something that could be much healthier for us, much more desired. But because it's not familiar, we don't have the algorithms, it instantly gets kind of raises a flag in the body. Because anything unfamiliar, statistically speaking, from a species survival perspective, anything that's unfamiliar should be categorized first as a threat. And only if we prove otherwise, then it can get downgraded to this is okay. So, generally speaking, things that maybe feel unfamiliar and like a lot of effort, or just really not the way you used to do it, there can be a lot of value to those things, because that might mean that you will break free of a pattern that actually isn't serving you. But that pattern feels familiar and comfy, kind of, because your body doesn't have to exert a lot of extra stuff to deal with it. So that to me would be how we can look at get out of your comfort zone. I would say is really a very powerful expression. I think we can apply it in really nice ways to not just like career and stuff, but to even our relationships, how we respond
Hmm.
to stress, things like that.
Yeah. I don't want to take us down a too dark of path, but it feels like this could go either way when we're thinking about these new experiences, and essentially getting the algorithm to fire in a different manner could be doing that in a positive way, but also could be doing that in a negative way. So is there in your experience, is there like a way to help with recognizing of like that past is now like these new experiences are maybe taking me the wrong way or the right way, knowing that it's retraining your perception of how you're going to react in this kind of chemical way?
Mm. Well, I mean, I would say that there are ideal, optimal states of being. And so that can be the guiding post. We generally want to have a certain level of ability to self regulate. And so that means that, again, I'm going to highlight this word flexibility is the name of the game. When it comes to anything that we do, we have to highlight flexibility. When you look at all the resilience studies, not all of them, but the really, really big ones, flexibility is probably one of the things that comes up the most, and actually makes it harder to predict how a single individual will actually react to stress, because the highly resilient people are very, very flexible in their approaches. So there is an optimal kind of way of being, and that is the main component of it is that we're flexible, and we're feedback responsive. And so what that means is that we are constantly we're able to monitor and then input constantly live data, like how is this turning out? Okay, bring that into the system. Can I adjust? Can I take that in and monitor my internal state and then make more adjustments? So there's not really a golden ticket of what people should do or even what the internal state is, because the thing is that at every moment, like, we're so dynamic, we're so complex, it might mean high levels of arousal that are excited. But if we stay up there too much, if we're in that high arousal level, then that actually can be very depleting after a certain amount of time.
Mhm.
Also, we love to be soothed and we love to have, lower levels of arousal. But if we stay there too long, that also can be very depleting for the system, because we need to have some skeletal muscle blood flow and movement and different kinds of actions to help us kind of figure out life. It's like trying to solve problems in newer ways. So, yeah, I would say it's hard to kind of give a blanket statement as to specific types of activities or even what that internal state looks like. So my main answer is generally to really think about flexibility. And I just want to add to that, increasing and diversifying your repertoire of how you deal with stress and life.
Mm.
And it doesn't mean you don't have your go-tos. Those are great. Those things that get you into a really nice state. If you want to feel motivated and energized, those do that. If you want to feel kind of less stimulated and calm down, you have strategies for doing that. So having a nice wide range in every moment, to help you in every moment get to a new type of state, a dynamic process kind of internal state that helps you operate the way you want to operate.
Okay, I want to pivot a little bit here because I am interested in how you ended up in this field and how you kind of got to where you are today. Because I know that your experience over the course of your career has been in a lot of different things. I know you were in intelligence. I know you've done a lot of work with students. So, what are some of those early moments that made you realize that this is the path and this is the part you really wanted to focus and hone in on in your field?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the biggest pivot for me in terms of career and the transformative moment, was actually when I took high school graduates on these overseas community service learning semesters. And I had quite a few that were going just down a trajectory they really didn't want to go down. And we had some one-on-one kind of coaching and then other types of activities that we did. And I remember that, my interactions with them were very positive, and I remember hearing from some of them that it was the first time they didn't feel like they were broken or defective.
Mm,
And then I also saw that as they were serving their the community there, as they were being of help to others, it also did something inside them. And they had different trajectories after that, and I knew about that from years afterwards of being in contact. And I remember that that was a moment where I really wondered, how does it happen? What happens in the mind that gets somebody to switch from going through making really bad decisions and going down one path to somehow switching on this light, in a sense that they believed in themselves no matter what had happened in the past. They knew they had something left to contribute. And so that really got me into the idea of neuroplasticity specifically. And that's what I ended up studying in graduate school. And the interesting part, though, was that although I was interested in the MRI scans and did some of that work, a lot of my work at NYU had to do with more of the physiological aspects of us. So, how our skin conducts electricity differently depending on our stress level, our eye movements, our facial muscles, our heart rate. And so that what was interesting about that was that tied into a much earlier experience I had working in intelligence, where I was doing a lot of different things. I was doing a lot of pattern recognition kind of stuff, but I also had to go through lie detector tests. And I remember one of my first ones, being hooked up to everything you can imagine. And I had to do a lie, like they made me lie in order to see my baseline. And I remember thinking I was so good at it, like that there's no way they detected it. And I couldn't tell if that was a good or bad thing. So, but then he showed me at the end the screens, like everything was like literally off the screen. It couldn't measure how stressed I was
Yeah.
internally based on that. So that was like such an aha back then already of like, whoa, there's all these signals that are being put out that we are projecting, and there are human lie detectors too, people who can pick up on that. But there's just stuff that's going on internally that so many of us are not aware are happening, but they are being projected out. They are signals, they're frequencies. And then I ended up seeing that in my grad studies as well when we were studying like stereotype content and having people do self-report as to whether they felt disgusted by certain types of people or not. And a lot of the answers were more what we would want to be socially proved, which is saying, no, I'm not disgusted by that. But when we hooked them up to different machines, their systems were saying that they were. There's very specific muscles that detect that. And we also were able to influence it a little bit through narratives, through the stories we told, villain or hero type of stories. So that was also very eye-opening to me in terms of we have these beliefs, we have these ways of operating, but we also have all these signals that are happening internally inside of us, but also that we are, without knowing it, constantly picking up in other people tiny little movements of whatever it is, disgust or anger, and those are getting registered into our system on unconscious levels. So that's kind of how I got into it, and I ended up working a lot with kids when I was in grad school in New York, both as a nanny, but also in research studies. And that was also eye-opening for me as well, just to see how kids react so differently depending on which adult is in the room. And
Mm.
that was also a big aha of like, there are a lot of people who think that child is that way. And they don't realize that if they saw the child with somebody else, they might not even recognize that kid. So that was also, tying into all of these little signals and also the words that kids hear, the facial expressions they receive. It impacts how we respond to events, how we respond to ourselves, to failure, to whether we'll try harder or not. So all of these interactions are going on, and that's a really big part of all the work I do now. Like in clinics, I'm measuring heart rate variability and brain waves and all that. So I'm continuing that work and trying to help people just understand how much of themselves they don't realize is operating on these unconscious levels, these influences, and that we can insert a little more intention. We can do it. It's
Mhm.
possible.
Yeah. I'm imagining everyone who has watched TV and thinks they can pass a lie detector test is now convinced they can't. I want to talk a little bit about your book and your podcast. So, you just published a book. Tell us a little bit about how that came to life and what everyone will get from the biomechanics of human communication.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I had dreamed of writing a different kind of book, a little more personal, and that will happen as well. But I got approached by a science textbook company they'd listened to my podcast and they thought that how I was explaining things was very accessible. So it ended up, that's what it is. It's a textbook. It's pretty big. And it's kind of a journey through so I use the word communication. That's the theme of the book. But what we use communication for, we use it to try to get our goals met. We use it to enhance our relationships. We use it to soothe ourselves or to inspire. But a lot of times communication deteriorates and we don't get what we want out of our communication interactions. And I would say that happens a lot. We're not really saying what we want to say, or we're saying things we regret. So many things are happening. And so I wanted to just show people how much goes into these interactions so that we can kind of have a little more compassion for ourselves as well in terms of why we seem to not be able to say what we really want to say. And also to be able to view another human as struggling with the same complexity. There's so many distortions we don't know are happening. There's so much of these little biases that we have towards detecting threat or not, that if we can understand that and we're in front of somebody and they're communicating with us in ways that we are finding challenging, having that understanding, I think, helps just soften us a little bit. We take it a little less personally because we're all kind of messing that part up.
Yeah.
And it's hard for us to override a lot of these influences. So the more of us that can understand this is happening, I feel like it might add a little more compassion to ourselves and others when things aren't, we're not communicating in really healthy ways. So that's a big part of my book. It's also a tribute. It's really a tribute to all the researchers out there. And it's just pages and pages of references, because I wanted it almost as a reference book for people to look at cool studies and learn about who did them. So that's my book.
Amazing. And the podcast,
Yeah.
because it sounds like the podcast led to the book, and season 4 just started as the time of recording, correct?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's fun to think about the podcast, because when I was about 6 years old, I had a tape recorder, a cassette recorder, and I recorded something called NERD, Nerd Radio, and I had pretend interviews with scientists and world leaders. I think I had Gorbachev on there, who was my sister, who was 3 in diapers. And I loved it. It was just who I was. And so it's, amazing to see that I am now doing the same thing
Yeah.
in many ways. So yeah, it started a few years ago. I post once a month because I put a lot of thought into each one. And I love it. It's one of my passion projects. So yeah, that's my podcast.
Yeah. They're amazing, and they're different topics each time, so there's always at least one you can go through and find that's something that'd be very, applicable to everyone's real life. I want you to find those old tape cassettes, and you should do, like, some bonus episodes and
Yeah,
release your old
that's a great
content.
idea. Yeah, I'll have to
Uh,
find them. I hope I'll have to digitize them soon, because the tapes are probably all
yeah.
worn out now. Yeah.
So as we wrap up here, what would be your parting advice to everyone watching this, from your field of, like, what's the biggest thing that you would recommend somebody could do, recognize, and take away from today?
I mean, I would say that taking a little bit of time each day to have some intention about how you truly want to feel, to figure out what is that internal state that feels really good to you, and getting clear on that, so that that can help guide some of the decisions that end up being made later throughout the day. Will they help you align with that? And a big part of that is not because we can control anyone else's reactions. I know it's very cliche to say, but we all know that's true. That, for example, if I'm entering a difficult conversation, or it doesn't even have to be a difficult one, but just any kind of interaction, there is an internal state that will feel good to you when you're in it, regardless of what's happening with the other person. If you can get in touch with that, it's like you're creating a little bit of an anchor, a sensory motor, kinetic, visceral anchor for your body to register for a moment. And that is what can help it create tiny little micro decisions, micro noticings of things that might
Mhm.
help you get back into that state. So yeah, that would be one of my tips.
Amazing. Well, Stephanie, it's been so fun to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It was an honor. Thank you very much.
And everyone else who's watching, you can learn more about Stephanie in the description on the YouTube page. And thanks everybody for watching today.